So I was having a bit of a discussion today on the topic of geocentrism and heliocentrism. Geocentrism seems to privilege humanity, and yet as Europe switched from a geocentric cosmological model to a heliocentric cosmological model, there seemed to be this shift away from worshiping God toward humanism, worshiping tradition toward classical liberalism. And one can think of this as a contradiction or an inversion, that as we switched, now this is totally ignoring the empirical side of things. Is the Earth the center of the galaxy? Is the sun the center of the solar system? Those are empirical questions, of course. So I'm not making a physical claim here, which is usually the problem we run into when we talk about these models, is mostly people are just concerned with what is the material truth of the situation. But I'm more interested in the representational perception, the symbology, and the way that people internalize visual models and use those visual models as metaphors for metaphysics, right? So if we conceive of particles, like each atom is a solid particle and it's whizzing around the universe, then we can come up with a metaphysical model where everything is Newtonian, everything is mechanical. It's like a clockwork machine, and God sort of winds it up and then lets it unfold. That sort of deterministic model is possible when you conceive of particles as being these little stones, these little atoms. But as we then move into more of a relativistic model, more of a quantum model, the visual representation then moves from being solid particles to being, amorphous blobs, probability fields, waves, not particles, but waves of electrons rather than particle electrons. And then we get into the dual nature of things. And as we abstract outward, it becomes harder and harder to conceive of a deterministic universe. That's irrespective of the mathematical models and the logical arguments or whatever. The empirical reality is something separate from the symbology of the model. Right? So, and we can talk about evolution and creationism in this way, that of course, I believe in evolution. But clearly there's an implication in evolution that we came from a pretty pitiful state, being like little lizards or little rats or little fish or whatever, and slowly over time we evolved to become the great thing that we are today. So there's almost a moral implication there, a metaphysic there, that we started off being inferior and then over time we became superior, as opposed to the ancient model of history that the Greeks wrote about, where, Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle would say that in the past we were great and then we had a fall. And we fell from greatness from the golden age to the age of silver, to the age of bronze, to the age of iron. This is the Hindu model. This is even the Christian model, the Jewish model, the Islamic model, that says Adam was close to God and then there was the fall. And after the fall, humanity came to a lower state than its original state. And that has moral implications vis-a-vis the concept of tradition and authority. So our teleology turns around and we're just trying to get back to God or back to tradition rather than create something new. That has implications for how we view the world. So I'm not even talking about a heliocentric versus a geocentric model here to challenge the material reality of things. But what I'm trying to investigate is this monumental shift in our cosmology. Did it have an impact in our moral systems and our ways of thinking? And again, there seems to be this contradiction that we move from a geocentric model, which I would think would be a sort of a solipsistic model that privileges humanity as populating the most important sphere, the most important planet in the universe. And then you shift away from that to a heliocentric model where now the sun is the center of the universe, or the galaxy, or the solar system, whatever. The sun is center and we're revolving around that. And I always sort of conceived in it as, if we identify the earth as humanity, and if we identify the sun as God, then a geocentric model would be a model in which God revolves around humanity. Humanity is supreme, and God is just this peripheral thing that revolves around us. If we move to a heliocentric model, then God is the center, and humanity revolves around God and serves God. So that's how I initially thought about this. And so it confused me, and it seemed to be a contradiction. It seemed to be a strange inversion that as we move from a geocentric to a heliocentric model, we would embrace humanism, we would embrace atheism, we would embrace materialism, we would embrace secularism, we would move away from traditionalism, we would move more toward the teleology of liberalism, progressivism, whatever. That isn't this a kind of a crossover? Aren't these two opposite trends contradicting each other? And I was trying to explore this contradiction. And one of the ideas that I arrived at was that the sun represents the social center. So as we move away from a geocentric model, we move toward a heliocentric model. The sun is the social center. And in this model, the earth represents the self. And the self is revolving around the social center. Now, from the perspective of the self, we're always doing our own will. Right? I'm hungry. I want to go eat something. I'm lustful. I'm going to pursue sexuality. I'm lazy, I'm going to pursue idleness and rest. So from the perspective of the self, all of our own desires come internally. We want food, we want sex, we want rest. We want these things, and so we pursue them. But in the heliocentric model, it's not that the earth is pursuing its own desires and it just wants to continuously revolve around the sun. No, it's the sun which is pulling upon the earth. The earth wants to escape the orbit of the sun, but it cannot. It's always drawn back in this circular fashion, this cyclical Sisyphean model. Sisyphus being, that ancient Greek story or parable of the king who has to shove the boulder up the hill only for it to fall back down again. So this revolution of the earth around the sun represents the way in which we pursue the social center. When we pursue sex, we define sexuality according to what the social center tells us. So what is hot and what is not? What is sexy and what is lame? What is cringe and what is cool? These are all inherently sexual concepts of attraction, and what's fashionable, what's not fashionable. They're subject to the social center. We don't define them. So we don't define what's the in style, what's the in fashion. That's decided by the social center and by the people who impact and create the social center, being the creative minority, the dominant minority, the media minority, whatever you want to call it, the cultural minority that controls the social center. We as individuals don't control that. And so our sexuality, we feel it to be this internal urge that is produced within ourselves, but in fact the way that we pursue sexuality to a great degree is defined by history and culture in this social center. So we're attracted to members, well, not even members of the opposite sex, I can't even say that. We're attracted to individuals on the basis of, does their clothing match the clothing of what corporate television advertisements tell me is the appropriate clothing? Do they use the lingo that is popular and fashionable? Are their ideas popular and fashionable? So, these are all important things to understand, and this extends into every area of life. So we think that we want a cool car, but actually, what is a cool car? That's defined by advertisers. That's defined by corporate advertising agencies who define, well, it used to be that a cool car sort of looked like a box. Well, now a cool car looks like more of a sphere. And a cool car used to be a car where the doors open sideways. Now a cool car, it's got the butterfly doors. These are not utilitarian, objective, empirical questions. Like, there's not really a lot we can say about the style of a car that makes it utilitarian or not. I mean, I guess we can talk about, how does the wind flow around the car, and does it have a lot of drag, and those kinds of questions, I suppose, are empirical in terms of how fast the car is. But if the car is not moving, if the car is stationary, and we're just looking at the car as an object of desire, those desires are not coming from within. Even though we feel that they're coming with it, we look at the car and we say, oh, that's so cool, I wish I had that car. But actually, we're not realizing the extent to which those desires have been implanted in us by our culture, our history, advertisers, the social center. We don't recognize that, and so we identify with these desires, we think they're coming from within when they've been implanted in us from outside. So in a sense, in this cosmological model, the sun here represents the social center, and we're always pursuing the social center. We never reach it. We never actually hit it. We never actually collide with the sun. We're always revolving around it. We're always chasing our own tail. We're never making progress. We're never cool enough. We're never sexy enough. We're never hip enough. We're always pursuing this endless cycle of trying to maintain this pursuit of acceptance in a social hierarchy, but we're never overcoming the hierarchy itself. We're never colliding with it. We're never entering into the social center. We're never dominating the social center because we're always individuals on the periphery, and we're never escaping it entirely and going off in our own direction according to our own volition. And in fact, even the concept of doing that has been commodified. So the concept of being a rebel, the concept of being a hipster, now has dozens and millions probably of clothing lines and websites and magazines and media production to cater to people who think of themselves as hipsters, as indie. Right? So that is its own scene, that is its own style, which is not defined by the people choosing it, but is implanted within those people by higher powers from within the social center. So, this is an interesting idea to investigate in terms of the work that Joel Davis is doing, where he asks, how can we take a formalist approach and ask, well, where do these desires come from? Who actually creates the social center? Which actors are a part of that? Because obviously it's not just one person. It's multiple agents and actors with contradictory ideals and goals. And so mapping that out and seeing what that's actually like is an important question. Although I do think there is an ultimate simplicity to it that has already been identified by both the extreme left and the extreme right, which is that whiteness is the big problem here. Whiteness is the problem that prevents the world from, it prevents global capitalism from reigning supremely. Whiteness is this identity structure that prevents commodification and consumerism from going to the next level. The freedom of movements of peoples, it prevents people from, the concept of Western civilization is something that prevents mass immigration. And of course, if we're just looking at things from an economic perspective, mass immigration is very beneficial. But if we're looking at things from a cultural perspective of preserving Western civilization, implicitly whiteness, then there's a huge problem there. So that is the biggest obstacle to overcome. I think if you're asking yourself, what cultural services or intellectual services or political services could I provide to the elites? And of course they have different interests. Some of them are Zionists, some of them are anti-Zionists. I mean, George Soros is an anti-Zionist, and he's a billionaire, and he's very active politically. So it's not the characterization of elites as Zionists or saying that all of them are Jewish. That's of course not true. Some of them are Jewish, but some of them are not Jewish. Some of them are Zionist, but some of them are anti-Zionist. So if you wanted to find the one uniting interest behind all these various elites, whether they're Zionist, not Zionist, Jewish, not Jewish, whatever their background, whatever their identity, the elites who create the social center of our societies are faced with the obstacle of whiteness. And if you wanted to be of service to them, and if you wanted to benefit from their patronage, you would want to come up with a way to limit or massage or somehow do away with or ameliorate or address the problem of whiteness, the problem of Western civilization, the problem of Western identity, because that is the real obstacle to the mass marketization, homo economicus, the transformation of the globe into a single free-flowing market. The biggest problem right now is Western chauvinism, whiteness, this concept of European nationalism. That's the biggest obstacle. That's really the biggest obstacle. So you would want to try to solve that problem, and there are people who do it from the right wing. So, for instance, Donald Trump now has the command of a majority of self-described American patriots. People who call themselves American nationalists are on the side of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is in favor of mass immigration. So that was a very smart, that was very intelligent, that was a very crafty and creative judo move, where he has now enlisted the support of a lot of nationalist, implicitly white or pro-white people in America. He's enlisted their support, and then he's gone and betrayed them. I mean, so that's a very powerful thing to do, to demoralize a lot of the right wing in America, and to also confuse them and to disorient them, to diffuse the problem of whiteness. Donald Trump has done a great job. Okay, I don't think he could have done a better job. I think he is one of the best presidents in American history, besides, other conservatives like George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan. I mean, they did a huge... I think it's really that amnesties for immigrants usually only happen under Republican administrations. So this is not a new thing. Donald Trump is not original. But he's done a great job of enlisting the support of a lot of people who otherwise would be against immigration. And he has quelled them, and he has demoralized them, and he has put them in a position of submission where he's set himself up as this authority, and you can't go further to the right than Donald Trump. So he's a gatekeeper. He's created this gate where you can't go past Donald. So that's very interesting in looking at this concept of the social center. It's very interesting to note that this problem of whiteness is the most universal problem that faces different elite factions. Again, there's not a single elite faction that controls everything. There's a lot of competition within the elite. But the single problem that they all sort of share is this problem of whiteness as being one that's limiting their ability to expand their power. It's an obstacle for them, greater than any other obstacle. So solving that problem, either coming from a radical left position of telling white people to kill themselves and encouraging ethnomasochism, that's one solution. But it's likely to produce a reaction, and then people like Donald Trump are there to control the reaction and to point it in this circular masturbatory action of, jerking off to Donald Trump and calling him the greatest president. And then you have the people on the left who attack Donald Trump as Hitler, and then the people on the right who are willing to defend him as, no, he's just a moderate, he loves people of all races. And so, this ultimately is a way of diffusing the problem of whiteness and, basically distracting white people away from defending themselves so that they can ultimately be, their interests can be put to the side so that the interests of elites, who are mostly looking for increased economic activity principally to expand their power, they want open markets. I think that's a pretty simple thesis that works in terms of finding the current social center. But going back to the original analogy of heliocentrism versus geocentrism, that in the geocentric model, the traditional model, the idea of the Greeks is that your passions are those things which rule you, right? And so to be a self-ruling individual, to be someone who has self-control, you have to be detached from your passions. That's the Greek concept. That's the Christian concept. That's even the Jewish concept to an extent, that you have to put your passions to the side and you have to do the will of God. It's a Buddhist concept of detachment. It's a Hindu concept of detachment, of the practice of yoga, the practice of the Brahmin. It's to detach from the passions so that you can pursue the path of enlightenment, of universalism. You detach from your own individuality and you become universal. And at that point, you overcome the social center, right? So there's this transcendence in the geocentric model where the social center is Earth, and these other planetary objects like the sun and the stars, Mars, Venus, whatever, in astrological systems, they are orbiting the Earth and they're pulling us in different directions. When we're born, you're said to be born into a certain astrological sign, so you have this tendency of personality because it's pulling you in a certain direction. And the concept of enlightenment is that you might choose one, sign or ideal or archetype, and you might go in that direction as a path toward away from your own self-centeredness, away from the social center. You see in the heliocentric model, we're always chasing the social center. We as little earthlings, we're always revolving around the social center. But in the geocentric model, we are the social center, right? And so rather than facing internally and trying to satisfy our own desires, we're always faced externally. We're always faced toward the gods. We're always worshiping the gods and idealizing the gods and trying to go out into that spiritual realm, trying to explore that world of archetypes and trying to escape ourselves. And that takes two paths, basically. The path of the warrior, which is, expanding oneself, going out into the heavens, commanding over the heavens, being like God, commanding Earth from a third-person perspective. And then you have the priestly perspective, which says, no, we're going to totally detach from our earthly desires. We're going to go out into this planetary realm, this third-person realm, this nirvana, this heavenly realm, where our own earthly desires don't matter so much anymore. So, and I don't think I've explained it as well as it was in my head at the time when I thought of this concept. But it is interesting to think about that we're always chasing the social center, even in isolation. And we do live in a period of isolation where people are having sex less often than ever, and yet we're watching more porn than ever. So we feel ourselves to be socially isolated, and it's very easy to socially isolate oneself. I mean, it used to be that if you wanted to be socially isolated, you had to go into a mountain retreat, or you had to live in a cave, or you had to escape society, and that was quite easy to do because urbanism was fairly limited. You only had to walk a few miles and then you were in the forest, and this was the state of reality for most people living in Europe or India or China or really anywhere around the world, is that you only had to walk a few short miles and you could get out in the middle of nowhere where nobody lived, or it would be a farm or something like that. It was very easy to escape the city and to go into peace and quiet and to escape the social center. But as we became more urbanized, as we moved to this heliocentric model, it's impossible. It's impossible because socialization in the social center is no longer dependent upon our interaction with other people in real time, because we virtualized the social center. And so the social center is now omnipresent. It's in your phone. It's in your pocket. It's on your wrist. It's in front of you right now. You're looking at a screen, I assume. You're listening to my voice. We're not socially interacting in real time. You're listening to a recording of me. So we have abstracted the social center. We've expanded the social center, the omnipresence of the social center, that sociality is around us at all times. There's no escape. You can't just go off into the woods, because it's being impressed upon you. Even if you wanted to, you can say, all right, I'm going to leave my phone at home. I'm going to leave my Apple Watch at home, and I'm going to just put away all the screens, and I'm going to go walk out into the woods. I mean, it's very difficult with the increase of urbanization. It's very difficult. And people are now going to extreme lengths. I mean, Ted Kaczynski tried to live in the woods, and then loggers and lumberjacks came to tear down his house, and that made him very angry. And he engaged in a campaign of rash action as a result. But essentially, the social center as it is today is less escapable than it was, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. It was fairly easy, if you wanted to escape society and to go on an ascetic path to try to escape the social center, to try to escape the expectations of society. It was fairly easy to do, and it's very popular compared to now. I mean, monasteries are sort of a joke. I mean, I see people who claim to be monks on YouTube, right? People who are like pretending to be monks, like Catholic monks, and they're on YouTube and they're talking about this and that. It's like, well, the purpose of a monk is you're supposed to separate yourself from society, not interact with society, not evangelize. So we've lost that to a large extent. We've lost, I mean, monasteries have become like tourist attractions, and they have their own Instagram pages, and so we're losing this to a large extent. I'm not saying it's extinct. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but certainly it doesn't have the same psychic power that it used to have. There's been a massive shift away from this priestly attitude of saying, we want to escape the social center, we want to escape the material life, we want to escape social expectation, we want to go off and detach ourselves from the thing of this world and focus on that outer world, that planetary world. So in a sense, putting Earth at the center of the universe was not about having materialism being the prime virtue, but it was about saying that, oh my goodness, I've got one piece of hair here that just loves to stick out. But really what it was about, it was saying that the purpose of life is to expand out from this small little dot of Earth, and to expand out into the universe, into that planetary heavenly realm, that realm of Platonic forms. That was the purpose of life that a lot of people saw and a lot of people pursued. And it wasn't necessarily entirely separate from the warrior path of conquest and expansion. It wasn't entirely separate, and there was a lot of interaction between the two. But that concept, as we've changed to a heliocentric model, we've changed from this concept of expansion of consciousness beyond the social center, escaping the social center. We've now gone into this rat race of urbanism where we're constantly chasing the social center. We're trying to revolve around it, we're trying to approach it, but we never actually get to it. We never actually make contact with it. We never achieve intimacy with it. There's this loss of intimacy, there's this dissociation, there's this abstraction that prevents us from ever making contact, so we feel like we're spinning our wheels. It feels like masturbation. Everything feels cyclical. We've lost this sense of transcendence. And that's kind of represented by this shift in cosmological models. Now again, I'm not saying that the Earth is the center of the universe, but what I'm saying is that it's coincidental. And it's interesting to view things in this poetic sense. I used to be very anti-poetic. I used to view poetic thinking or coincidental thinking, or the concept that, people would identify signs in their life. Oh, well, I was thinking about, my grandmother. My grandmother loved bluebirds, and then I saw her, she loved doves, and then all of a sudden I saw a dove fly up in a tree, and I saw 3 doves, and that's representative of this and that. And I looked at that kind of coincidental thinking and symbolic thinking with a lot of derision and a lot of resentment and a lot of feelings of superiority. That was superstitious thinking, that was backwards thinking, and we should be higher than that. We should be above that. We should be superior to that. We should understand that's just a coincidence. That's just a trick of your consciousness, that you're seeking out these patterns, these narratives. You're looking for symbols and material reality to reflect your own internal consciousness, and I looked at that as ridiculous. And I tried to separate myself from it. I tried to ascend beyond it and to be enlightened and to separate myself from that irrationality. But then I discovered that our political world is ruled by irrational forces. It's ruled by nationalism. It's ruled by identity politics. It's ruled by sexuality, and it's ruled by concepts of gender, and it's ruled by narratives of history, which history is filled with conflict and sadism and all kinds of terrible things, but people will they'll selectively read history whichever way they want. It's very easy to do, to present a narrative of history making one party the bad guys and saying that this party is responsible for everything bad, and that kind of myopia where if you only look at the last 70 years of history, then you can paint a specific picture in which white people are responsible for every bad thing, and white supremacy is the defining feature of the historical struggle that we're undergoing. And then some people take it back 500 years to Columbus, and then they look at white supremacy from that perspective. And then some people take it a little bit further and they go back to Christianity, and some people say, well, Christianity is the real problem. And some people take it back further and they say, well, no, it's urbanism that's the real problem. So depending on how far back you push the scale of your history, you can selectively paint a picture that favors your moral narrative, and that backs up your moral narrative of saying, well, of course, this thing, whatever that thing is, this is the reason why we have problems. If we could just eliminate this one thing, then everything would be fine. And that happens all the time, and it's very irrational. I mean, the way that people choose to view history is they go in with a preconceived notion, and they try to justify that preconceived notion. And some historians are very intelligent, and they're very good at creating arguments. They're very good at debating and BTFOing the opponent, and they can have a debate with someone where they marshal all kinds of facts and figures, and they have everything memorized, the Ben Shapiro style, just talking very fast and throwing things at people, and you, of course, don't understand anything, and did you even know about this particular historical event? Yeah, I bet you didn't. So you can do that, and you can look impressive, and you can confirm the biases of people in the audience, and you can bolster their faith in your narrative. And that's something that a lot of people are very talented at. People who are more intelligent than myself can do that very well, and they can make a lot of money off doing that. I mean, people like Jordan Peterson can present a narrative of history in which the 20th century, the horrors of the 20th century were a product of collectivism, and his historical myopia in I guess the 20th century is the only century that exists to him. And that's the supremely most important century, and all of the suffering of human history is nothing compared to that which we experienced in the 20th century. This myopia allows him to make these arguments in favor of centrism, in which he, destroys the Nazis, and he destroys the socialists, or whatever the term for the left-wing people is. So he can do that by pigeonholing the data into a specific time scale. This is what people do. So I looked at that and I said, well, there really is no meta or universal or objective framing that we can use here. Everyone's going to come up with their own little subjective framing of the facts, and they're only going to refer to facts within a specific framing. They're going to call anything outside of that framing irrelevant. So if I try to bring up Genghis Khan, they'll say, oh, that's irrelevant. Well, says who? Well, says you. They've decided that they're going to exclude those facts, and they're only going to focus on the relevant facts, which are recent history, in the way that they want to spin recent history. So when I was faced with this irrationalism, I became less confident that there was some form of universal, scientific, objective narrative that could unite us all. I thought it was something like atheism or science or progressivism. I thought that was a solution that could transcend, different human cultures, and could bring us all together as one human community, and we could all agree that, first we had the ancient Greeks, and then we had, some Romans, and then we had the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and scientific breakthroughs and the Industrial Revolution, and this is the narrative of history I bought into, that I thought was a sort of universal narrative that would appeal to everyone, and we could all become part of this global scientific community. And over time, I started to see that the subjectivity of people was what ruled their lives, not any kind of objective narrative I could come up with. And then I started to realize that this narrative I had, I didn't even invent it. I didn't come up with it. It was fed to me. It was given to me by authorities that I trusted in. And I still trust these authorities to an extent. I don't deny that the Industrial Revolution happened. I mean, I'm not a total schizophrenic, I guess, is one way you could describe that. I don't deny the moon landing. I mean, I don't place any special importance on it. It's not something that I'm really interested in refuting or affirming, because at the end of the day, this subjectivity is what is important. This subjectivity of experience that people gather facts according to their own goals. They have a goal in mind, and then they set about gathering facts to support their goal. The myth of science is that we go out with no tabula rasa, blank slate. We go out with no preconceived notions, and we just look at the data, and then the data is our God, and we listen to whatever the data tells us to do. And science can be descriptive. We can say, well, objectively, we threw the apple up in the air and it fell to the ground. Everyone can agree. But we can't agree on, should we be throwing apples? Is apple throwing something that's moral to do? We can't agree on the prescriptions. Okay, well, gravity exists. What are the moral implications? We can't draw moral implications. And that's really, I guess, what matters at the end of the day. I mean, we could believe any number of things cosmologically, but it would not solve the problems of depression and suicide and hopelessness and friendlessness that we feel, the lack of intimacy, this continual chasing of emotions, the purposelessness of reality that we're faced with when the social center is godless and atheistic. We're faced with these problems. Some people don't really care about them. Some people aren't interested in answering these questions. I do have sympathy for people, because these are problems that I struggle with. How can you overcome these problems? If there is no authority telling us that everything will be all right, if there is no sanctuary to escape to, and it's not even that I want to go live in the woods and be a priest or a monk, but I want to know that there's someone out there in the world who is doing that work, who has that option, who's pursuing it on my behalf. I want to know that there are some monks in a monastery praying for my salvation, because even if I'm not enlightened or detached enough and God-loving enough to go out and do that, I want to know that there are people who are doing it on my behalf, and maybe if I die and I'm reincarnated, maybe I can shift more in that direction, that possibility is there. But as we shut out that possibility with urbanism, and this we might call it radical heliocentrism, the radical chasing of the social center, it feels as if we are more and more trapped. We are trapped by the gravitational pull of the social center. We cannot expand out into the universal cosmos. We cannot be detached from our own desires. We might watch a no-fap video, or we might get some diet advice, or we might learn about fitness, or we might learn about pickup artistry, or we might read books about how to be successful, think and grow rich, how to get rich quick, how to make money. We might read about these things. We might be given advice about how to succeed in school, how to be sociopathic, how to appeal to people, how to be successful in advertising, how to win, how to be successful. We might study these things intensely, and this might consume all of our daily activities. And at the end of the day, even if we are successful and we do overcome all of these things, it's still not satisfying. And worse often, or more often, and even worse, is that people preoccupy their time with trying to discover ways of re-explaining the problems that we have. Like the problems, everyone understands what the problems are. On some level, like whiteness is a problem. I mean, the left agrees it's a problem. The right agrees it's a problem in the extreme. Of course, the center, the mainstream right wing, does not agree it's a problem. They think it's something that should be ignored and pretend it doesn't exist. But there is this open recognition that whiteness is a problem. Race is a problem. And it's important. So we understand that there are these problems, and we're just continuously reframing, like, well, should the ethno-state allow in Italians? Or, well, can Sean King be a transracial leader of the black community? So on the extreme right wing and the left wing, there's this agreement on what the problem is, but all of the discussion surrounding the problem is like this esoteric abstraction, theoretical hypotheticals of, well, if we had an ethno-state, what would that ethno-state look like? If we went into like is transracialism a legitimate ideology? What does it mean? How do white people abandon their raciality? Do they date people of another race? Is that sufficient? And no, if you actually talk to the theoreticians in leftist academia, they'll tell you, no, it's not enough to date someone of another race. You can still be a racist and date someone of another race, so that's not enough. So what step can you take going forward? Like, what new masochism can you invent? So like the right wing is theorizing about like what kind of supremacist or separatist or what would they do if they had power and they don't have any power. And then the left is theorizing of like what new masochistic step that they can take when it's you're getting to this ridiculous point of like, okay, well, how badly can you beat yourself up before you just kill yourself? I mean, there's sort of a limit to masochism, and yet they intentionally convolute the process of masochism to the point where they make it an endless process of discovery, that you're always waking up. Every day is a new day. You discover some little tiny little thing you were doing that something, you finally have this revelation. Oh my gosh, I just realized that mayonnaise is racist, and I'm gonna have to throw all of my bottles of mayonnaise in a tin can and light it on fire and flush it down the toilet. I don't know, like all this symbolism builds upon itself without respect to any objectivity. It is, I mean, the quest of defeating racism, like the goal of racism is defeated, is like the sun, and we, like little these little earthlings, were orbiting the sun. We're never reaching the goal, but we're continuously orbiting. We're rats on the wheel, continuously going through this process. And it doesn't have an end to it. So there is something final, there is something comforting about the notion of, well, there's going to be a sector of people in society who go off in the woods and they try to separate themselves from this process of chasing the social center, and that's going to be our cosmology. Is that, no, life isn't about chasing the social center, life is about freeing yourself from the social center. So I don't know. I mean, there are certain theological concepts about like God. God is this unapproachable infinitude that you can never ultimately reach, that you could be reincarnated a million times and you would never achieve unity with God, because God is infinite. And then there are other concepts of heaven or nirvana, in which godhood or divinity is something attainable. It is something we can reunite with. So there are, I guess, different traditionalist perspectives on that. But I don't know. I think that's enough for today. Thanks for listening. I appreciate your audience, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.